Hoppy here for another episode of How Does This Really Work in Illustrator? Today's episode, the Align and the Distribute panel. Of course, you can call that up under your window menu, call up the Align panel. Your Align panel doesn't look this way? It's probably because when Adobe sets this up as a default, all you get from the Align panel is the Align and Distribute section. This little section is hidden. Why? I'm not really sure. But if you go to the Align cheese grater and choose Show Options, this is going to show the distribute spacing. So, why do we need a video on this to go ahead and be able to align the objects? Because there's always tricks with this. There's always something that doesn't work the way you want to. So, in our align our objects left, on their center points, on the right, top, middle, or bottom. So if I select all my shapes with the selection tool and say, you know what, let me align those vertically to the center, that's great. Let me align those all the way to the top. And then I look, and it's like, yeah, that looks pretty good. But then I turn my ruler on, and I drag a guide down to the very top of my object here. And I realize that, well, that didn't align all my objects. Why are these objects sitting below my line here? I wanted this to align to the object. Okay. If we go into the View menu and turn into Outline mode, which is Command or Control Y, it's like, okay, these are all lined up here. But it's interesting. It's like, well, how did it line it all up when I'd like it to align it to my stroke? Well, the default is when you align something, it doesn't pay attention to the stroke. Okay? The stroke is completely ignored. So if I had an object that had a huge stroke here and I tried to go in and align everything again, and I use my align center and then use my align top here, and I try to align everything there, it seems like everything's off because it doesn't pay attention to the stroke. And it's like, well, that's frustrating. It's like, sure, it is. So how do you get around that? Well, you could do the long way where you go in and you actually take all of your strokes and you go under Object, Path, Outline, Stroke, which would be crazy because then you don't have the ability to use your stroke. But now when you outline everything, everything will align together. But now you've lost your stroke, so I'm going to undo that. So, how do we fix that so that it does align to what you see as opposed to just the shape? Well, interestingly enough, if I go under my Illustrator Preferences and go under General, here's something. Use Preview Bounds. Okay? How would you know what that means? Use Preview Bounds. Use it for what? Okay? Well, using the preview bounds says what you see is what's going to align to it. I mean, they couldn't make this any more cryptic if you asked. So using the preview bounds now, when I set up my stroke on an object and select everything, and now when I go in and I align this, there we go. Now, how do you know if this preview bounds is turned on or turned off? Well, it's pretty simple. If I draw a shape here, and my bounding box goes all the way to the far edge of my stroke, I know that when I use my Align feature, it's going to pay attention to what I'm seeing. Okay? And what I'm seeing right here is the preview. So this is the bounding box around the preview. If I turn off the Use Preview Bounds and I look at my object, you can see that my bounding box is now based on the shape and not based on the preview. Okay? So that's a really nice tip to be able to have. I wish they could go through and do that. Oh, look at that. There's the shortcut right there. Probably never even knew it was there. It's a very small menu, but you can use the preview bounds right there. Now that's cool. So now you don't have to worry about aligning things and have them be out of alignment. You can just go in, say use the preview bounds, and you can see the bounding box now goes to the very edge of everything. Wonderful. Okay, so we know how to align things. We can align things to the top now, the very top, the centers of all the objects here, or the bottoms. How does it work with lines? Well, lines always find the center point, okay? So here if we align them on the centers, if you divide this line into two right here, it's going to be right there in the center. So these all work, okay? There we have it. Now, how does the distribute work? Well, the distribute works pretty simply. When I'm going in with a distribute here, all I have to do is put my first object where I'd like it, my last object where I'd like it, and all my other objects wherever I want to in between. And then, if I take my shapes and I use my distribute feature, it's going to distribute basically either on the left-hand edges, the centers of the objects, or the right. So if I do the centers here, it's going to equally space the center from here to here, and then equally space the center from here to here. Now, it does not align them up or down, top or bottom here. It just simply distributes the spacing between the centers. If you then want them aligned on the centers, then it will align them on the centers here. This will just distribute the spacing here. So let's take a look at this with a distribute function. So if I simply take these circles, put them here, and then I just randomly place my circles here, I put the first one where I want it, I put the last one where I want it, and all the other ones in between are going to follow my first and my last. I call this fence posting. You put up one fence post and the other, and you distribute everything between those posts. Boom, there it is. Now it doesn't align them. That's what the alignment's for, okay? But wait a second. When I did this alignment here, I noticed when I did the alignment, the bottom, the first one and the last one shifted up. What happens when I don't want that to move, okay? Which one does it use in order to go ahead and figure this is the one I want, okay? Does it use the lowest most? Does it use the uppermost? So I go ahead and align this, and it's like, well, that's weird because it looked like all of them moved. So which one is it using to go ahead and distribute this? Well, if I go through and I want to align these all, select them all, but I want to align it to one specific object rather than having Illustrator aligned to the object it chooses. Then what I need to do is I need to go to the Align To, and I'm going to say Align to Key Object. Now all of them are selected, and what I have to do is while they're selected here, just simply touch the bounding box of the object that I would like to use as my key object. Okay, that's basically the master. That's the one that I want to use. So they're all selected. Don't have to hold down any special key. Just simply select the bounding box or the shape of that, and that's now going to be my shape that it uses as the key object. Now if I say align everything to the top here, it's going to move everything up but keep this key object right there in its position. That's super handy. Okay, I love that. So let's get to the distribute spacing feature here. The distribute spacing here can also be done kind of the same way between the distribute objects. The difference is that I may have different size shapes, okay? Some large, some small. Now, if I select all my shapes and I say distribute them through the centers here, and all those centers will be the same distance, do you notice people are like, well, this doesn't work. See, the spacing is different. But I didn't say distribute the spacing between the objects. I said distribute the spacing between the centers. And if I were to go into outline mode and I were to draw a line between my centers here, that line would be exactly the same length between every single one of my centers as I go because they're lining up perfectly. Look at that. There's the centers right there. Now, how do I get the spacing so that they're equally spaced between the objects and not between their centers or their edges? Well, I can go distribute the spacing, and if I click distribute the spacing, it's going to use my first one and my last one as my guide, kind of my posts, okay? And it's then going to distribute the spacing equally between the shapes. Okay, so what happens if I have a really large stroke right here? And then I go through and say, okay, distribute the spacing between the shapes. All right, so it does keep track of that. And the reason why it keeps track of that is because I told it to use the preview bounds, okay, which is the outer edge of what I'm seeing. If I were to take this and I were to go ahead and create a very large stroke here and then say distribute the spacing equally between here, okay, you'll see that the spacing is not the same. It's the same between the bounds here and the bounds here and here, but visually, because of the stroke, the spacing is not the same. And that's because we're using the actual shape. We go into outline mode, and now you can see that distance is exactly the same between these. But in the preview mode, it isn't, because we are not using what we see, our preview, to be our guide. Once we use our preview to be our guide and distribute the spacing, now that's going to work. But why is it that you can never get a hold of this particular measurement in here? Like, I want to have a certain amount of distance in between here, all right? this is great that I can take and I can distribute the spacing equally by setting up my first one and my last one and equally distribute the spacing based on the stroke weight or the shape, either one. But how do I actually get this spacing right here? Well, here's the deal. When you want to go ahead and you want to get this spacing, what you have to do is you have to make sure you select a key object. Without selecting a key object, you will not get this spacing. Okay? If you just select all your shapes here, you don't get that spacing. And the reason why is because it needs to know what shape that you want to begin to use to specify the distance in between. So say I want 50 millimeters in between these objects. I type in 50 and hit return, and nothing happens. Why? Because you're supposed to know this. Once you put in your value and you click return, now you then have to go back and actually press the button to make it match that. Okay? Usually when you put in the value and hit return, it happens right away. No, not with this. You have to put in the value and then you have to click distribute the spacing. So if I type in 35 and hit return, nothing's going to happen. Then I have to press the button and now it happens. So these are the little things that make all the difference in the world when you're trying to use this. Major source of frustration with this, but you know what? Quick and simple to know these things, and all of a sudden it's like, aha, this works. And that's what makes the Align and Distribute panel so easy and simple to use, because it is quite easy. But it's those little tricks of measuring between your preview bounds, which is what you see, as opposed to measuring between just the actual shapes, and understanding how to align to your key object or select a key object to then distribute your spacing and add a value. So hopefully this was helpful, because when you try to align or distribute these things here, those are some of the hurdles. Check out my other videos on YouTube, a lot of other useful tips.